In July of 2015, Sears sold 266 of its own stores, sold them to a company called Seritage Growth Properties for about $2.7 billion, $580 million. Then Sears signed a lease to keep renting the same stores it had just sold, at a higher price than before. The chairman of Sears was also the largest shareholder of the company that bought them. 3 years later, Sears filed for bankruptcy, owing more than $10 billion, and its own bankruptcy estate went to court to try to get some of that money back from him. Sears did not start out as a cautionary tale. It started in 1886 as a mail-order watch business run by a young railroad agent named Richard Sears. Within a few years, it was selling almost everything else: clothing, tools, furniture, even prefabricated houses, shipped by rail to towns that had no department store of their own. By the middle of the 20th century, it had become the largest retailer in the United States, a company so central to American commerce that its catalog was sometimes called the Consumer's Bible. It pioneered installment credit for ordinary shoppers. It built house brands, Craftsman tools, Kenmore appliances, Die-Hard batteries that became so trusted they outlived the stores that sold them. In 1973, it finished construction on its headquarters, the Sears Tower in Chicago, which for nearly a quarter century was the tallest building on Earth. At its peak, Sears operated more than 3,400 stores across the country. Keep that number in mind. We're coming back to it. The crack that would eventually reach Sears didn't start at Sears. It started at Kmart, a smaller discount chain that filed for bankruptcy in the early 2000s, weighed down by debt and outcompeted on price. Circling that bankruptcy was a Yale-educated former Goldman Sachs arbitrage trader named Edward Lampert, who had spent the 1980s learning risk analysis under Robert Rubin, the future U.S. Treasury Secretary, before founding his own hedge fund, ESL Investments, in 1988. Lampert began acquiring Kmart's distressed stock in 2003 as the company worked through bankruptcy and emerged from that process controlling it. Under Lampert, Kmart became known less for what was on its shelves than for how tightly its balance sheet was managed. Costs cut, capital spending minimized, stores treated less like places people shopped and more like assets on a spreadsheet. None of that was illegal, but it was a signal of the instincts about to be applied to something much bigger. In November of 2004, Kmart, now Lampert's company, announced an $11 billion deal to acquire Sears, Roebuck and Company, a retailer roughly 3 times its size. The merger closed in March of 2005. The combined company took a new name, Sears Holdings Corporation. Edward Lampert became its chairman. The story most people know from here is simple. Amazon happened, shopping moved online, and department stores like Sears couldn't keep up. That's true as far as it goes. Every mall-based retailer in America felt that pressure over the following decade. But it doesn't explain why Sears fell so much faster and so much further than comparable chains that faced the exact same online competition. Macy's struggled. Kohl's struggled. JCPenney nearly collapsed. None of them lost 7 out of every 10 stores in a decade. None of them had their own bankruptcy estate file, a lawsuit accusing their former chairman of stripping the company for parts. To understand why Sears is different, you have to look past the Amazon narrative and into the deals themselves. And the clearest one to start with is Seritage. By 2015, Sears Holdings had already spun off several businesses to shareholders in transactions that would later draw scrutiny. Orchard Supply Hardware, a chain of 89 stores, distributed to shareholders for no payment to Sears in December of 2011, with Lampert and ESL ending up holding 48% of the common stock. Sears hometown and outlet stores spun out through a rights offering in October of 2012, worth roughly $362 million, of which insiders acquired about 81%. A 44.5% stake in Sears Canada, worth an estimated $500 to $620 million, given up for no consideration that same November. And in April of 2014, Lands' End, Sears' profitable catalog business, valued at over $1 billion, spun off to shareholders for nothing, with insiders receiving an estimated $756 million in value. in a transaction that a pre-spinoff $500 million dividend left the parent company, according to the later lawsuit. In July of 2015, Sears sold 266 properties, active operating stores, into a newly formed real estate investment trust for about $2.7 billion and immediately signed leases to keep operating out of those same buildings at rents higher than what it had effectively paid before, to $749 million more than what Sears received for it. Existing shareholders, including Lampert and ESL, were also given subscription rights worth an estimated $400 million for free, and a side agreement gave ESL a controlling interest in the new company beyond what its shareholding alone would suggest. That December, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway disclosed an 8% stake in Seritage, a detail the retail press seized on as a vote of confidence. But Buffett was buying into a real estate company collecting rent. Sears, the retailer paying that rent, was a different business entirely, and its position wasn't improving because a famous investor liked its landlord. What the Seritage deal actually did was formalize something that had been happening piece by piece since 2011. Value moving out of the operating retailer and into entities that Sears insiders, especially Lampert and ESL, held disproportionate stakes in. Once Sears was paying rent on stores it used to simply own. That rent became a fixed, recurring drain on cash that in an earlier decade might have gone toward inventory, store maintenance, or wages. Store conditions that visitors and former employees described through those years. Bare shelves, deferred repairs, escalators that stayed broken didn't happen by accident. They happened because the money that might have fixed them was increasingly obligated elsewhere. Sears Holdings store count fell from more than 3,400 at its peak to roughly 700 by the time it filed for bankruptcy in 2018. And Lampert wasn't only extracting value through spin-offs. Through ESL, he was also lending Sears money directly, secured against its remaining assets. By September of 2018, ESL held approximately $2.5 billion of Sears debt, which meant that by the time Sears actually collapsed, the same person sat on every side of the table, chairman of the company. Sears Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on October 15, 2018, listing $11.3 billion in liabilities against $6.9 billion in assets, with roughly 700 stores still open and close to 70,000 people still employed, listing more than $10 billion in debt against roughly $1 billion in assets. Lampert stepped down as chief executive that day. Its debtor-in-possession financing, the loans that keep a bankrupt company operating during the process, totaled $600 million, and half of that, $300 million, was being negotiated as subordinated financing from ESL. Even in bankruptcy, Sears was borrowing from Lampert. The bankruptcy also produced one of the plainest illustrations of who absorbed the cost of Sears' decline and who didn't. Court filings from that November show Sears seeking approval to pay more than $25 million in bonuses over the following year, $8.4 million to 19 top executives over just 6 months, and another $16.9 million spread across 315 senior employees. At the same time, more than 7,000 Sears and Kmart workers had already been laid off that year, over 4,000 of them after the bankruptcy filing alone, and many received little or no severance. Sheila Brewer, who had worked at a Kmart for 17 years, told reporters she'd been told to expect 8 weeks of severance and received 2 before the payments simply stopped. "Are you for real?" she said. "What type of world is this? How could the judge say yes?" A bankruptcy court can approve retention bonuses as necessary to keep a company's leadership in place through a difficult restructuring. Whether that reasoning felt persuasive to the people who just lost both their jobs and their promised severance is a separate question. One the court filings don't answer because it isn't the kind of question bankruptcy law asks. 3 months later, on January 16, 2019, Sears went up for a bankruptcy auction to determine whether it would be liquidated outright or sold as a going concern. Lampert, through a new entity called Transform Holdco, placed the winning bid, $5.2 billion, enough to keep up to 425 stores open and preserve roughly 45,000 jobs that were otherwise at risk. A bankruptcy judge approved the sale on February 7, 2019. The man who had chaired Sears through its decline was now, once again, its owner. 2 months after that, on April 18, 2019, Sears Holdings bankruptcy estate filed a 110-page lawsuit against Lampert, ESL Investments, Seritage Growth Properties, investor Bruce Berkowitz, and a group of former directors, including Stephen Mnuchin, who had served on Sears' board before becoming U.S. Treasury Secretary. The complaint identified those 5 transactions: Orchard, the Sears hometown rights offering, the Sears Canada spinoff, Land's End, and Seritage, as fraudulent transfers, alleging they had moved billions of dollars in value out of Sears to insiders in the years before it collapsed. It is important to be precise about what happened next. The lawsuit did not end in a finding that Lampert had, in fact, defrauded Sears. In September of 2022, a bankruptcy judge approved a settlement of $175 million, the majority of it paid by insurance policies, with the agreement explicitly stating that the defendants admitted no liability and that the plaintiffs acknowledged they had acted in good faith. No court ever ruled on whether the transactions were fraudulent. The case simply ended years later with money changing hands and no verdict at all, whatever the truth of intent. And intent is the one thing court records and financial filings can't fully settle. The pattern in the filings is not in dispute. 5 transactions over 4 years, each moving value out of the operating retailer and toward entities where Sears insiders held outsized stakes, structured by the same small group of people who also controlled the company, giving that value away. Sears today operates 5 stores, not 500, 5. In Braintree, Massachusetts, Concord, California, El Paso, Texas, and 2 in Florida, in Orlando and Coral Gables. 3,400 stores at the peak. 5 remain. The easy lesson here is they didn't adapt to the internet. That lesson is wrong, or at least it's incomplete, because it lets the actual decisions off the hook. The real lesson is narrower and less comfortable, when the person negotiating a deal on behalf of a company is also, personally, the person profiting on the other side of it. The deal does not need to be proven fraudulent to still be a governance failure. Independent oversight, a board genuinely willing to say no to its own chairman, is not a formality. It is the only mechanism standing between a company's assets and whoever happens to be sitting closest to them. Sears had committees. It had outside directors. What it didn't have, when it mattered, was anyone with the standing and the will to slow those transactions down. Of the 266 stores Sears sold to Seritage in July of 2015, most don't operate under the Sears name anymore. Seritage spent the years since redeveloping many of those properties into apartments, offices, and stores for other retailers entirely, profitable in the end for the real estate company, even as the retailer that used to own them kept shrinking. And of the more than 3,400 stores Sears once operated across this country, 5 still open their doors. The rest of the buildings are still standing, mostly. They just don't say Sears anymore.